Thanks everyone for taking time to attend this first among many from the series of Inform or Reform webinars organized by the Architecture and Sustainable Design pillar at Singapore University of Technology and Design, or in short, SUTD. So special thanks to our ASD, the Architecture Department Head of Pillar, Professor Erwin Viray, and also our Associate Head of Pillar, Professor Yo Kang Chua, for masterminding this exciting series of webinars and publications. And also thanks to the administrative team. And of course, I would like to thank the organizer of this 2021 Asia Pacific Architecture Festival for including us here in Singapore. So maybe a brief introduction of myself. I'm an assistant professor in both the pillars of architecture and sustainable design and the new program, Design and Artificial Intelligence at SUTD, where I teach and conduct research on creative use of deep learning for architecture and urban design. Currently, I direct the research laboratory Artificial Architecture in designing and developing new bespoke architecture AI learning models to solve issues related to the built environment. So today I have the honor of having two of the most important practitioners, theorists, and educators of design, computation, and architecture. Professor Alyssa Andrasek, who was actually my teacher at the AA when I was based in London. I owe very much to her intellectually. And Professor Leach, whom I first met in person as a teaching colleague at the Institute of Architecture at Bauhaus Dessau, when I was living in Berlin, rather briefly. Of course, the three of us have maintained our academic exchanges since then, even though we're no longer in the same place. I will now make a brief introduction to two of our distinguished guests, one after the other. Give me a second. Professor Alyssa Andrasek, architect, academic, and innovator. She's the Professor of Design Innovation Technology at Melbourne's RMIT University, a founder of BioThing, a co-founder of Bloom Games and AI Build. Her work introduced concepts of a renewed logical core of architecture, high-resolution design for complexity, and aesthetics of unseen. Prior to joining RMIT, she held the position of Director of BPRO, that's Bartlett Perspective, Architecture Design Research Laboratory, Wonder Lab at UCL, Bartlett, focused on computational design, artificial intelligence, and robotic constructability. For more details, you can check out her website. And Professor Leach, he is a professor at Tongji University, China, as well as Florida International University, US, and European Graduate School, and has taught at the AA, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, GSD, SciArc, and USC. He's also an academician in the Academy of Europe and the recipient of 2 NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Fellowships to fund research into developing 3D print technology for the Moon and Mars. Very exciting to have both of them here. So more info could be found also on the festival website of this event. So in addition to today's panel discussion on the topic of the education of an architect and an AI point of view, is also the launch of my new book titled Artificial Architecture Intelligence and Design, published in late 2020 with the support of SUTD. So if you are keen to purchase or find out more, you can either scan the QR code or click on the link in the chat box. Maybe Charmaine could paste it there sometime later. So this small book was actually written a year ago. And since it is the first of a series to be published by ASD, the architecture faculty, it took a longer time to finally decide on the format. That's why it took quite some time. And just so that it is a format that could be replicated for the subsequent publication, which would talk about other subjects of interest beyond just AI. So this slightly belated launch today. More relevantly is the underlying motivation for writing such a book. In fact, it is pedagogical. In other words, about the education of an architect, an attempt to define this very notion of architecture intelligence in the light of an implicit relationship shared between the domains of AI and architecture. So this new discourse called architecture intelligence arises from the very lack of it. It attempts to bridge the widening conceptual void faced by today's architects and designers, especially my students also, who are urgently in need of a theoretical framework to critically engage with a newly emerging design material, which is AI, or more specifically, machine learning and deep learning. Here are the kind that's from New and also Harvard GSD professor Anton Picon, which I think quite succinctly expressed the intention of the book and its relevance to this webinar as well. So some of you who have registered for the webinar might have noticed the main poster or banner used. It is a work that I did a few years ago, which was published in the special issue of 2019 AD article edited by Jules Ritson called The Discrete. Although today's discussion is not about discrete, however, my contribution with the article Discrete Sampling has a lot to do with our discussion today. The article, as you see, is about this idea of a different way of seeing architecture. So in this case, seeing afresh the all-familiar Barcelona Pavilion designed by Mies van der Rohe. But from an AI point of view, in what sense? In a sense that shifting from a neoplastic decomposition of objects floating in space to the ways in which a deep composition neural network would, in fact, decompose and encode forms, in this case, in a convolutional way, looking at statistical patterns. This non-human point of viewing architecture from is actually part of my earlier investigation on the theory of architecture sampling that I did at my PhD back in EPFL in Switzerland. So the title of today's panel discussion, as some of you might have guessed, is adapted from the same title of a major book publication and its MoMA exhibition in 1971. What the twist here for today, though, is that this point of view could be also either a human point of view of AI on architecture education, or a non-human AI point of view of human architecture education. So exactly half a century ago, a radical pedagogical experiment from the Cooper Union School of Art and Architecture under the leadership of American architect John Hajduk, an obvious abandonment of the education models of the École des Beaux-Arts and the École Polytechnique, reappropriation of the 1920s visual vocabulary of cubism, futurism, neoplasticism, constructivism, or more accurately speaking, grounding the education of an architect in pursuit of the strict inner logic of architectural language. Highly idiosyncratic in the sense as a model of education, but if you think about the alumni or the graduates from the program, these famous architects include Daniel Dubinsky, Elizabeth Diller, Shigeru Ban, Toshiko Mori, and many others. And in the 1970s to the 80s, in fact, between the then and now, history shows that there will be, in fact, subsequent radical reinvention of the education model for architecture. So shortly after the 1971 Cooper Union exhibition at MoMA in New York, at London's Bedford Square, the AA was transformed in 1972 by its new chairman, Alvin Bryansky. A complete overhaul, replacing the education model of the post-war modernist professional training with that of the now well-known unit system at the AA. Thus, seeing pedagogy as a medium for architectural experiment and critical inquiry beyond just vocational training, an education model that ought to be, in its own words, conditioned daily, weekly, and annually. Perhaps even more radical than that of Cooper Union, the AA then had produced graduates like Zaha Hadid, like here we see in the picture, the late Zaha Hadid, Rem Koolhaas, and many, many others. And then in the 1990s, mid-1990s, with Bernard Schumi himself trained by the AA unit system also, made yet another radical pedagogical transformation, and this time around at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University in New York. The paperless studios, a precursor of the subsequent design studios in schools of architecture today, from digital architecture, computational architecture, parametric architecture, to the now AI architecture, or some call it the neural architecture. It was also where the architecture protagonists like Greg Lynn, Stan Allen, Hani Rashid, and many others influenced the next generation of architects. And 2000 might be characterized by the formation of the DRL at the AA. Yes, back to London's Bedford Square. This is also where the DRL founder and principal of Zaha Hadid Architects, Patrick Schumacher, trained his student in the style of parametricism, a style that Schumacher coined, and a style that has permeated much of contemporary architecture today. So I'm sure many of you might not have agreed with my curation of schools and their respective pedagogical models, as I quickly construct this rather very brief historical framework to somehow facilitate the discussion of today's webinar. Actually, I decided to skip the slide for 2010s since the choice can be highly debatable. In my opinion, it's the B Pro though, but you know, no offense to whoever that disagree. Besides my own prejudice or favoritism, the selection has quite a lot to do with the academic experiences of our guests today, which you will find out quite soon. They will share some of their experiences shortly. For those in the audience who might have missed the QR code, you can always scan it. Yeah. Anyway, so with the going back to a book, just 2 more slides before I hand it over to Professor Neil and Professor Alyssa. With the print constraint of the book in terms of the number of pages and also the impossibility of embedding animation videos, if you are interested, you could find some more visuals on my sandboxing work in progress website. It's not the official website for the lab, which will be more serious. This is more kind of sandboxing. Likewise, if you are keen to see the emerging global collection of work on the topic of AI and architecture, including mine here on this page, you can find them here on the online platform called the AIarchitects.org, created by the new collective called Neural Architecture Group, which was formed just late last year. Of course, I'm also the co-founder. Actually, this initiative is there was first AI and architecture repository and discussion platform. Thus, this kind of underlying pedagogical purpose related to the education of architect, in this case, an AI point of view, of course. But in this case, multiple points of view of AI and architecture, because we are basically creating the most avant-garde and forward-moving practitioners or theories on the issue of AI and architecture. So now I will hand the time over first to Alyssa, and then after that, Neil will do a short presentation as well before we move on to the discussion proper.
Thank you, Immanuel. Should I share my screen?
Yeah, let me stop mine. Okay.
Share my screen. Do you see my screen? And
yep.
Perhaps we could minimize this so we can see more. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to support you in this. It is true that Immanuel was my one of my most talented students, along very many amazing talented people I worked with in my now over 2 decades of engagement in academia. And my practice is always distributed between this kind of academic research and practice in different startups that I initiated. But interesting choice of institutions, Immanuel, because paperless studio, I was educated in paperless studio by some of the people that you mentioned, and I also taught there. That was my first teaching position. And then after that, obviously, DRL at the AA, where I spent 4 years. And then finally BPRO, which with Frederic Migaru, basically I curated and we curated a group of very talented young designers that are now making lots of noise around the globe and doing some fantastic work. So I personally sign up for your choice of institutions, but of course it's always debatable. And I think at the moment the situation is much more distributed and global. There are really a myriad of centers and collaborative development of the knowledge. So I will just briefly introduce myself, my work, but through this brief introduction, I will also try to introduce some topics that maybe can be useful for our discussion later. So when I started my work, the key question for me was how do we build for complexity? What can be the architecture for complexity? Increasingly complex environments. And one superpower of architecture that I always thought we have is the power of complex synthesis of myriad of agencies. And in the world that is increasingly being converted into information, for me, the key to look into was the computational fabric, because and the fabric of information, because that was the territory that can bind all these different agencies, and for the first time in history bind them explicitly rather than metaphorically or in some sort of aleatory ways. So I very seriously engaged with computational design very early on. And another issue which ended up being a topic of my PhD dissertations many years later was that I recognized that that there is one shared feature between complex systems that we find in nature and the most acute and most developed aspects of technology today, particularly AI, and that is the idea of high resolution, or that they share the property of high resolution. So when I started my practice biothing in 2001, I did not look at biomimetics as many people think, but actually how the information spreads in biological organisms. And so because it was the most advanced model of information distribution I was able to find. So I focused on this kind of evolution of the logical core in architecture. And interestingly enough, already in 2001, I was saying that it learns through the exposure to design process as well as we learn. And that was then talking about artificial intelligence. It's just that at the time, we didn't have technology to engage with it explicitly quite yet. So I was trying to find methodologies and ways to engage with this idea of architecture as ecology, as complex ecology through information. So working with many algorithms throughout my career, I always progressively looked for increased discretization of algorithmic building blocks in order to be able to introduce architecture to ideas of explicit adaptation and performances as the real ecology does. So how do we do that? So many algorithms, again, that we used in 2004 when we introduced multi-agent systems, for instance, and more discreteness. Why discreteness was important? Because the more discrete you go, the more adaptive you can be to the systems and agencies outside of just the pure formalization and abstraction of algorithm. Computational physics, working with data, with real data of materials, of air flows, etc. Many of these things was very much present in my work as well. So, and again, this idea of resolution we see in complex systems in nature, such as in bone, that nature does not waste material. It's happening through the computing of physics, of biology. So how do we bring that into design and architecture? Many examples that we've done. This is actually from the Bartlett from BPRO. Examples of with fabrication, with algorithms, ultralight structures. So if your structures could be at this kind of resolution, and currently you're working on developing cold spray and metal structures and metal alloys where you can have a structure with different molecular density, with different strength, with different weight in different parts. So in other words, at the moment you're working on the scale of building blocks at the scale of, for instance, dust particles. So extremely high resolution through simulation, through fabrication, robotic and 3D printing and otherwise. So what kind of architecture becomes possible if this is your detail of, let's say, a wall or something like this? If it comes closer to that kind of section of a bone, how can we come up with some unseen aesthetics, render invisible, visible, and series of super performances? This shift from causation to very many correlations is also covered by theorist, historian of architecture, Mario Carpo, who also included our work on the cover of one of his recent books, The Second Digital Turn. We don't have time now to go into this, but please check it out also for expansion of some of these arguments. And then, of course, the correlations and training, something that, as I said, I already said in 2001, it learns not only us. So now we can really engage through AI, through machine learning, for instance, deep learning, into these processes of training your robot to see while it's fabricating, etc. So there are many examples of work that we've done in that territory. I will just briefly show one quick example of high resolution project, which was a Croatian National Pavilion for the Venice Biennale in 2018, relatively recent, where I designed this field of 500,000 voxels. In the end, we had a shorter time to produce it, so it ended up being 40,000. So again, working with matter, with time, with constraints. But this is a super light structure, 3.3 meters tall, or 8 by 8 meters in plan, only 275 kilograms heavy. So why I'm saying this is because most of buildings today, actually all buildings today, are at least 10 times heavier than laws of physics are telling us they could be. So that also implies a huge CO2 emissions and other issues. So really looking into how can we put more science, big data and AI into buildings to change the situation that we are in. It's really a matter of urgency, and really the client here is the planet in peril itself. Another reference to a project with the metal 3D printing. So again, we are getting there. We will be soon having super high resolution structures. Another territory I'm working with, because as I said, architecture as ecology implies different orders of scale. So the idea of, in the context of planetary crisis and imminent population growth, the idea of building high density and low coverage architecture that could coexist with wilderness, or that can be also high quality, because current buildings, for instance, towers, are not using all the science, all the knowledge and data that we could input into them. So this research is looking into that. How can we develop high density, high quality architecture? This is really sculpting by data. So, and using different models of machine learning, 4 or 5 now my PhD students are using, in terms of evolving these different typologies. And I must just give a footnote here that in 2001, when I started teaching, I was the first studio at Columbia that actually introduced scripting and code into the design studio at the time. And because humans are not so, especially the creative minds, speaking of education, are not so natural or with the code and abstractions. Most of them are not. Immanuel was actually very good with that when he was a student. But I invented this game, which was this kind of discretized building blocks components. and combinatorics of them producing this kind of very simple input, complex output, one of the basic principles of complex systems. So it was popularized through this product Bloom that later we developed many years later actually, but in 2001 already I designed this game for students to intuitively teach them the logics of computation. And in this case, this is one of the recent ones. Intro exercises, again, there are maybe 80, even though it's the same component, 80 different states of how it can connect to itself. So again, this is a human and machine collaboration, because at the moment we cannot develop machine learning algorithms that can develop exact blueprint of these structures, but we are using augmented reality and certain localized algorithms to give us tendencies of this system rather than exact fixed states. Again, very much in tune with complexity. And then again, this type of logics are applied to all sorts of problems and scales. Just a quick example from a workshop on Mars, for instance, that we did last year within this Digital Futures event that Neil was actually curating. So here we see some of the very quick ideas of how we see the life on Mars, or different infrastructural energy production, biomass production, food production, infrastructures to prepare, for instance, Mars for human inhabitation. So this is a very, again, very large population, looking at physics, looking at adaptation through discrete algorithms of multi-agent systems, looking at the beautiful Mars dunes, local physics, etc. And then another problem that we looked into, so taking the experience from Mars, extreme environment, to somewhat less extreme, but quite extreme environment of abandoned mining sites in Australia. There are over 60,000 of them. In the United States, there are over 450,000 of them. So these are everywhere, this kind of hidden scars in the landscapes of the planet. So then looking into how we reactivate them, again, with the same logics of these discretized elements. So really looking, using abstraction, using big data, using AI to find certain design sequences, because pattern recognition, when you get to such a massive sea of data, becomes a problem of a machine as well, because machine is better at recognizing patterns when you have a big data involved in design process, so it enhances human designer. These incredible Aboriginal paintings are suggesting what these landscapes could be. After all, Aboriginals were designing the whole continent. It's probably the biggest design project I can think of on Earth, the kind of biggest estate on Earth, the very fantastic book about the Aboriginal project of curating all these complex processes in harmony with the environment. So these are just some of the snapshots of massive and highly adaptive solar fields, for instance, and other infrastructures at the abandoned mining sites. Again, very high resolution data of winds and how wind become somehow agency or collaborator, co-designing projects with us. So this is just some of the very recent projects that we've been working on. And this kind of shift from continuous models of mathematics to discrete models of computation and AI now enabled an explicit process of multitude of agencies and introduction of big data into the design process. So why this is important? Because for the first time in history, we can really treat architecture, cities, built environments as large, complex ecologies, because they can be now explicitly informational. That's the key to enter them. And I think it's a very momentous time to start doing that. And so we can open the door for architecture for increased designability within these complex ecologies, allowing for designs, proposals of unprecedented nature, complexity, and scale. And I will finish here, and then we can continue in discussion.
Thanks, Alyssa. Very interesting.
Just trying to regain control over.
Yeah, thanks. So Neil, you could share your screen now.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for the invitation and congratulations on the book. That's a first. I mean, it's very special. I'm very much aware of that. And thank you, Lisa, for showing me that work. It's fantastic as always. I mean, just to say briefly, I mean, I'm primarily a kind of theorist. One of the things I'm doing now is directing the Doctor of Design program, this 2-year non-residential program at FIU, where we look at the theory of AI, and to my mind, it is incredibly interesting. I'll maybe come back to that question in some ways. And we're operating online and developing in a very interesting sort of way, because you can bring people together and have discussions across the planet in a way that never happened before. This was a session we held about the Architectural Office of the Future involving Wolf Pricks. And that's, I mean, although I'm primarily a theorist, I also do teach design. And I've been working with Daniel Bolajan, who's been teaching my students cycle GANs and style GANs, and this is some work that he's been doing, Deep Himmelblau for Wolf Pricks in Corp Himmelblau, which to my mind is absolutely astonishing work. It's really opening up a new field of inquiry. And AI, my students have to say, when they write essays, 95% write about AI. It is their world. It's part of who they are, and it's going to hit them. We'll talk about this later. I think it's going to hit the profession right when they reach the peak of their careers. So there's something very new and very exciting that's happening here. And my students, in a much less sophisticated way, possibly, have been working with this thing. This is a study of morphosis using style GANs, and they're really fired up by this new domain. So, but I'm surprised how few schools of architecture actually are engaging with it just yet. I think you guys in Singapore are very lucky to have Manuel Coate there, because there are very few people right now who know what they're talking about, and Manuel is one of those individuals. But just to say something about my background briefly, I actually started off as a Latin translator. When I was fresh out of college at the University of Cambridge, I translated Alberti's treatise on architecture, on the art of building in 10 books, where he laid out for the first time what the architect is as a kind of an intellectual, as a professional, and that kind of started off my kind of publishing career. I then qualified as an architect. I'm registered in the UK, but then I moved to the University of Nottingham, and I started shifting more into the kind of contemporary theoretical perspective, and this came out in 1997. A reader in cultural theory, rethink key architecture, where all the kind of key thinkers at the time, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Derrida, and so on, were kind of, all their writings of architecture were gathered together, and that in many ways set the tone for what I was going to be doing in my own research for a while after that. So a series of books came out, and I was invited to go and teach at places like Columbia and AA, where I met Alisa, and indeed, so I then started kind of working on publications looking more at computation itself. On the left-hand side, you can see one of Alisa's designs of the cover of Design for a Digital World that came out in 2002, 2004, Digital Tectonics and Digital Cities, I think 2009. And there's a bunch of other ones. There was a whole series of production. But now, more recently, I'm working on the question of AI, and this is actually this week. I had these cover designs of my books, my 2 books coming out on the theme of AI, and I'm trying to theorize AI. And what I would say is so interesting about AI is really, I struggled for some time trying to really develop a theoretical approach on certain areas. I mean, you can't say that much about a robotic arm; it kind of moves, right? Okay, maybe you could talk about it in terms of prosthesis, but actually, there's not a lot you can do. Whereas AI kind of locates you back firmly in the center of things, because you have to deal with questions about consciousness. And to my mind, what makes it most interesting is it becomes a mirror in which you can understand human intelligence, and lots of kind of questions about what is creativity, for example, emerge out of this. And to my mind, it's a very exciting time to be a theorist, because all of a sudden we have this new domain, which is really causing us to reflect on what is the nature of what it is to be an architect, and so on and so on. I should say on the bottom here, you can see the hallucination, shall we say, using style GANs by Refik Anadol of the work of Zaha Hadid architects. And what is interesting is that you have this one particular moment in this hallucination when you get something that actually does look like it's been designed by Zaha itself. When I started working on this initially, I started working on one book, shall we say, and looking at how amazing AI is, and I began to realize that actually that it's both good and bad. I'm a bit like Elon Musk on this, who obviously uses AI in Tesla car and SpaceX and so on, but at the same time warns us about the danger to humanity. In the end, I managed to convince my publishers at Bloomsbury that we needed to split it up into two different books. In other words, one, a very positive book about the potential of AI. So on the left-hand side, a book with a white cover, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, an Introduction to AI for Architects. At the time, Immanuel's book wasn't there, so I needed to kind of write an introduction about it. And then on the right-hand side, The Death of the Architect, a book with on the dark side of AI, and it's got a black cover, right? The Demise of the Architectural Profession in the Age of AI, in many ways they're both two sides of the same coin. When you start looking at the stuff that's produced by Daniel Bolojan and others, and you look alongside the work of Wan Yu He and X Cool. It's fairly clear to me that actually that a profession that's already in danger is going to be further marginalized by the advent of AI. I think it's going to have a huge impact. But I want to say that although I mean, there have been arguments about the danger of kind of drones that can kill, AI-directed drones and AI surveillance and so on. I don't think that AI per se is necessarily evil. I don't fall into the kind of the trap of technological determinism. I think it's a question of how you use it. And you can use it for good or bad. I mean, like a kitchen knife. A kitchen knife you can use to cut your vegetables, or you can murder someone. So I don't actually think that AI is so inherently bad. Rather, I think it's terrifyingly powerful. I mean, it's amazing, and what it can do, what it's going to be able to do very soon, is going to make a huge difference to the way we operate. So the second book then is about The Death of the Architect, which in my prediction is actually this going to happen by the end of this decade, and which is kind of interesting in some way because the first book in my career was Alberti, who defined the architect as we know it. His was the first book to be published in architecture. In the first page of that first book, he defined precisely the architect as the concept of the architect as the person in charge, and so on, this intellectual figure. And then that was back in 1450. And then by 2030, my prediction is that we'll reach probably the end of the understanding of architects as we know it, partly because of AI itself. And by a strange coincidence, the name Alberti begins with A and ends in I. I'll stop sharing there, and yeah, okay.
Thanks, Neil. Interesting, very interesting. In fact, I got a few of your books. Yeah, very inspiring. So now sorry, there's a. Sorry, there's some unexpected drilling going on here. But anyway, so let me just quickly pose a few questions before the drilling gets louder. So I want to ask, Neil, you mentioned about this two-sidedness of the same coin. So the positive and negative side of AI, and how does that apply to the education of the architect? In the sense that what are the things that we should be informed of about, or being critical about AI, and as we teach our students how AI may be related to architecture and the profession in general. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's fundamental, right? And I think I also use the term architectural intelligence. One of the books we produced last year was called Architectural Intelligence, and I think that's the way we're going anyway. But I think that kind of the point about this is that we're sorry, we're educating individuals who are going to be at the peak of their profession in about 25 years' time, where the world will have changed significantly. And I think therefore the educators really have an obligation to be up to date and be alert to the possibilities of what the future might bring. We focus a lot on the history of architecture, but very few, apart from people like Liam Young, really talk about the future. And I think we're forced to engage with that. So I mean, and it's very clear that it's going to have an impact on things. I mean, the way I talk about it in terms of my book, it's a bit like the self-driving car. I mean, the self-driving car, as soon as you don't need a driver, um, as soon as your car is self-driving, you don't need a driver, and as soon as you can start generating automatically buildings through AI, you won't need architects. At least you won't need so many architects. I think the point is now already we're using AI as a form of extended intelligence. You don't need so many people in the office. The offices will already be shrunk by a considerable amount. So we have that obligation, and the real problem about education is often you get these dinosaurs who are professors who kind of trained 30, 40 years ago, and still preaching that same message. And my favorite story about a professor was one who used to be very popular when he first started teaching, and at the end of his career there were only 6 people in the front row of his lecture hall, and he said, I don't understand what's going on here. I'm teaching exactly the same subject as I was when I first started. I mean, that's the point, is in a sense we have to be up to date on things. And it's absolutely clear to me that certainly my university, every single subject, every single discipline will have a component of AI taught by the end of the decade. It's absolutely clear that this is going to be a radical game changer for the profession of architecture. So as educators, we have an obligation to address these things.
Right. Also moving to Alyssa, you have led a few startup, really interesting ones like AI build. So from that perspective, I mean, what are the things that I don't know, you have taught your student to, how to navigate this really complex new area where architects suddenly could create really amazing technological startup like AI build or many others that you were involved in. Yeah, maybe you
so
can.
What is the question? What is the question?
That your experience in not just teaching students on the use of AI or computational design, but then it led to this really interesting startup. It's amazing how you did it. So maybe you can share about your experience.
And not just the startups, but I think something to continue on what Neil was talking about, my experience, because as I said, I was the first studio introducing code into the design methodology. And whenever I work with students, I don't use just the latest software. They always ask me, so which code language you're using or which software? That is irrelevant. It's somewhat relevant, but it's always trying to develop larger understandings or within a larger ecology. What are the fundamental first principles of complex systems of code? And then when people start having that kind of larger understanding and at the same time virtuosity in working with these new environments, then they can be creative with them as well. And then lots of these sort of entrepreneurial ideas also happen. With AI Build, we did lots of, within Wonder Lab, my research lab at the Bartlett, we did lots of fabrication, innovation in fabrication and code and things like that. So I was really encouraging young researchers to think about applications out there in real world, and there are so many possible applications, and to be entrepreneurial about them. So then we had lots of interesting examples. Someone like Manuel Jimenez Garcia, who started Nagami company for also 3D printing, AI build that tested different business models and in the end came back home to that, what I call logical core or actually intelligence and software of these processes, is now specializing on that. Jose Sanchez, who was actually studying in the same generation as you remember, in the same studio. He was teaching and working with me, and we started developing, I mean, he would teach technical part of the studios, and I was telling him, well, let's record some videos so you don't have to do this lecturing every time. So he started doing that very successfully and started Plethora project as well. So it really comes, there are so many possible applications and so many possible roles for architects. And I don't think there is a death of an architect necessarily, but death of an architect as we know it. I think actually there is a potential enhancement and expansion of an architect, but only if we take it seriously. And I think certain, I mentioned them briefly, it's impossible within 5 minutes, but the superpowers that architects naturally have, these are native powers that we have, which is complex synthesis. Historically, always have to synthesize between multiple elements. Now it can be on steroids, or it could be accelerated with the introduction of AI, even though I don't actually like that term. At the moment, I'm talking more about machine learning and specific aspects, because I think artificial intelligence is a misnomer in itself. But this other kind of cognition coming into these processes and then enhancing architect, expanding practice could actually be a very exciting future for our field, because that's a key skill that we need in the world of big data, in the world of complexity. And another one is, of course, pattern recognition, visual training that architects go through, that especially the virtuosic ones, it's very quick. And I think the combination of this pattern recognition that computers do and then human ones, which is, by the way, very different, creates a whole new territory as well. So I think it could be a very long conversation of how we train architects for the future, but I think some of these ingredients, I always pay attention to them and try to make sure that young students, that they understand this, that they actually almost like mutate. I sometimes say I produce army of mutants, because but in the most positive sense.
Yeah, so going with that subject, I'm wondering, open both Neil and Alyssa, might there be some structural changes that may be made more conducive for such an uncertain future for the architecture students? For instance, in the past, we have, like in the slides, I talk about the unit system, the paperless studio. Might there be a new kind of pedagogical model that require radical structural changes? Do we forsake studios, or do we augment it to the point that it is about also learning, I don't know, ML, machine learning, deep learning techniques and all that? Yeah.
I mean, maybe I could, yeah, I mean, I think what we found with Digital Futures was suddenly this whole domain opened up of being able to do what we're doing now. And it started off, we cancelled Digital Futures last year, and then I had my final review in April, and I had Philip Yuan from China and Gilles Retsin from London in the review, and I suddenly thought this is opening up other things. And then Matthias the following week had his review, and there were 1,000 people following him. So that's when we launched Digital Futures World as an initiative, and we got 12,000 applications for that. And suddenly you could see there was this possibility of this incredible discourse, global discourse, that actually, in some ways, the important thing about this was it made educational ideas available for free to anyone over the world, around the world, which kind of, so education was no longer a privilege, but a kind of human right in some ways. And we continued that with a panel, which I'm sure many of your listeners would have listened to, on every Saturday. And then on a Sunday, at the same time, we have the doctoral program, DDES program events. And what is really interesting about this is not only can you bring access, and you've broken down the walls of the classroom and made it accessible to all, but you have a kind of immediate response, which is astonishing. And it strikes me a bit like a brain. You've been there, Immanuel, part of these things, and with Daniel Bolajan there, and all these people together, there's a kind of thinking together, which is absolutely astonishing. And I think, therefore, it's more the kind of what we've discovered, which is already there in the first place. We knew about it, but somehow we didn't realize its possibility. the way that we have a global classroom now, that has completely changed things. And what we're looking at now is the possibility of a more formalized shared platform whereby you might team up with ETH Zurich or ICD Stuttgart and things and share doctoral programs. So to my mind, it's not the unit system, but the kind of global system that's opening up. And this idea of a global brain, I think it's the most exciting thing. I don't know what Lisa's felt in terms of her teaching, but my students love this. You know, they say to me, you know, I feel like I'm in the front row of a lecture hall. So we don't have lectures anymore. We have discussions, we have seminars, we have conversations. So to my mind, it's completely changed the name of the game. So that's the biggest development for me.
Yeah, that is definitely a very important one. This kind of accessibility, erasing this kind of global distances or temporal and spatial. But I also think we need to access other forms of knowledge. So it has to become extremely cross-disciplinary. Architecture needs much more science. We need much more science in the built environments and things like that, much more philosophy. And I think AI, let's stick with that word and erase it for today. The AI could be that layer that opens up those territories for us, because even though, for instance, in my experience, I was one of the most extreme educators working with computation and code. So I would actually make my students learn how to code, write algorithms, and execute them towards design. But it's painful for humans sometimes to do that. So these days I'm actually working on automating sequences of design processes, so it can become a conversation as I would have with a human collaborator. Again, very different cognition, but open conversation. I can imagine that this becomes also then conversation with other forms of knowledge, other experts, and not just human ones, again, non-human as well. So this kind of interconnectivity that it could happen. One thing I want to comment though, because Neil was saying, oh, AI is great and we have it now, and unfortunately we don't have it now. That is the reason why not many are still are yet using it. And the ones that are using it on a very, it's just a tip of the iceberg. You know, we are using style transfers, image-based data, which is very exciting. It's fun. It makes us have different, makes us think speculatively, what are the possibilities. However, this is just an image data. It's very far from dimensions that we need in order to be channeled into built environments in the kind of scale and applicability that I can imagine. And I had many conversations with computer scientists from Turing Institute in London, from UCL, from here in Melbourne. And when I described to them what I want to do, just some components of what they are telling me, you're 30 years ahead of your time, or we don't have computational power to support that. I think actually we are not 30 years ahead, but maybe 10 years or something like that, until we have computational power that we can actually go there and really make some changes so that the buildings that are being built out there are really transformed through the power of this new territory. So we are not there yet, but you know, we can speculate and put our toe in the water, but because of the computational power. And algorithms.
I'm not sure. I mean, some of it's a bit scary, frankly, some of the stuff that's coming out. I mean, Wan Yuho, who's one of my DDes students, has got a company called XCool. And what they're able to do now is mind-blowing. I mean, really mind-blowing. They're saying, forget BIM, we don't even need that. Theodore de Galanis, another one, has been working on infrared and other sort of software tools, which are performative ones, and they're incredibly powerful. Now, and Daniel Bolojan, I mean, the big problem, of course, is 2D, but now Daniel Bolojan is beginning to develop a 3D application of those things. I don't think we're so far away from it. And just to pick up on another thing, I mean, one thing I really do agree with you is I think the term artificial intelligence is really a misnomer, you know, in many ways. I mean, I see it maybe as a form of synthetic intelligence, but the idea that it's artificial and therefore the real intelligence is what we have. I mean,
why would we reproduce our intelligence? We need other kind of communication.
No, I think, you know, the standard definition that Margaret Bowden has, basically saying that AI is trying to do things that our human minds can do. I mean, it could do way ahead of those things. You know, I think the kind of that AlphaGo experience with Lisa Doll, it's doing things we can't even conceive of. And I think we need to sort of, that's one of my arguments, is that we have to go through a second Copernican revolution and realize that our limits, our human intelligence has certain limits, and it can go way beyond it. So I don't know. It is, of course, it's something that I mean, because of Moore's law, or whatever you call it, things are speeding up exponentially. But I've noticed in the last few weeks the kind of changes that GPT-3, for example, is producing, and it's astonishing. And that my last lecture course last semester, halfway through it, one of my students just told me, "Oh, by the way, I've got a Tesla, and they just updated it. It's now fully self-driving." The speed of change is really the thing that I find exhilarating, but also terrifying. So, I mean, I think the point is this. I mean, we had Tom Main talking the other day, and he was saying, well, you know what, with these tools, the great thing is I don't need 80 people in my office. I only need 12, and I can get to know them much better. So that's my point, is that 68 people don't have a job. So even though we might not necessarily immediately see that impact, it's gradually going to be eroding the profession of architecture that is struggling already for other reasons.
But professional architecture so far had input into very small percentage of built environments to build globally. I think we could, I mean, there is so much work to be done. Look at the state of the planet and the situation we are in. There is so much work to be done. So we just need to open our minds and find other models of how to hack into all this different, I don't think it's just this kind of exclusive work of 3% that architects do, 3% of buildings.
I got some question from the other 97% of the architects in the audience. So I think Mr. John Ting, he wanted to speak, I think. Are you there, John Ting? He wanted to have a conversation. Are you there? Okay, maybe he waited for too long. But we do need to kind of give the time for the audience as well. We've got another question from Dani Khemawan. Listening to Neil's explanation, you argued that professional expertise is becoming more widely distributed, and of them distributed to AI. How should current architecture education start to embrace responding to future collaboration between architect and AI in terms of practicing architect? Because in other fields, for example, in health and medicine field, at the moment, people today frequently Google a symptom served by AI instead of talking to a doctor. Yeah, I mean, I think the primary way it's going to operate, it is at the moment, is extended intelligence rather than just AI versus humans and things. And that model of I mean, it's had its teething problems, right? I mean, the IBM Watson, for example, trying to be used in applications in terms of medicine. But the idea is that we won't need doctors so much. We could have medical assistants that are having recourse to all these AI applications, which of course can draw upon not only our own medical histories, but the entire medical histories of everyone anywhere. So I think that's a model that probably will show us how we're going in architecture. But I mean, just to kind of comment that I think to go to the 97%, the XCool's vision is actually a little bit terrifying, because it's putting the AI in the hands of the developers to produce a kind of stuff that really does, the architect wouldn't be involved in it at all. And it is astonishing what can be done. So it's, but I think the first step is to know how. I mean, I think the point is, in many ways, is for us to be aware of the issue and to be preparing ourselves for what's going to happen in the future. And there are ways of overcoming things. I think the notion of what an architect is going to be transforming completely. I mean, I suspect that it's going to go somewhere much closer to what you and Alyssa are doing, Immanuel. I mean, it's going to be somebody who's a kind of, maybe when you type the word on Google, the word architect, you get computer architect. And I think that's possibly what we're going to have in the future, architects who are kind of completely conversant with these technologies.
Just a quick comment maybe on these developer-based applications, because there are many of them now based on some form of AI. they're actually scary to me because what they're propagating is existing models of development. They take data of existing real estate websites. They take lots of data, and technologically they are interesting, but conceptually they're failed in my mind because they're propagating existing problematic models. And that is the problem. We need to rethink what we do with these technologies in the environments that we, rather than and same is with images. You take existing images and you propagate them as this kind of synthetic composites. So you take images of cats, whatever, and then you make a new cat. But you know, I want to make a new creature that would be impossible.
But you can do that easily enough if you kind of
impossible monsters.
but I mean you can do that by you know, breeding, I don't know, orchids or coral with architecture. I mean, so there are possibilities of that. I mean, I agree that what the problem is that you have a sort of slightly limited data set if you're just basing on the existing. There's actually what I think actually this problem is that you know, saying AI isn't so creative, you know, it's limited. I think architects are limited. You know, we tend to sort of keep within safe constraints of what's been done before and not do anything too outrageous. It's got to be a little bit like Rem or Zaha, but if it's looks crazy.
But that's what I'm talking about. So, but we are still the one that have to drive conceptual layer. So that's what I'm saying is the problem. I don't think there is lots of creative thing that we can achieve with AI. There are already amazing tools, but what we are doing with that is not so amazing. It's just some flashy images and some replication of, for instance, real estate practices that are already detrimental.
Well, yeah, maybe I can just. I mean, I think that from my research in my book, I found out that actually there are basically two different areas. One is the experimental image-based stuff, of course, that you get with GANs and cycle GANs and whatever else, you know, and that's great in the studio, and my students love it and so on. But actually, there's another domain which is actually the stuff that they're preparing they're developing for the office, and there are a number of practices, of course, and some of them more deep learning based than others. But what's happening, which I think is a kind of crucial driver of change, is going to be the fact that now clients are saying to their architects, I want you to use this platform because I know I can get better return on investment in my building. And that's going to be the game changer as far as I'm concerned. That is what's going to happen. And I'm pretty sure that it's going to go similar to the way that it is at the moment in terms of sustainability. Every architect's boasting, I'm more sustainable than you are, I'm more LEED certified than you are. I think pretty soon it's going to be, I use more AI than you do. And I think that's going to be the real game changer. I mean, for better or for worse.
But isn't that PR basically? If you know, it could be any kind of AI. You know, in fact, going back to the discussion about this, maybe deep learning is not the answer, not the ultimate AI model, because after all, it's dependent, as we all know, dependent on the data sets, which essentially comes from the world that we live in. So being an originator still is a problem. At this moment, I would also, there's some more question on the Q&A. Just want to address our audience. John Ting, could you unmute yourself so that we can hear you this time around? Yeah, are you there?
No.
Okay, great. We can hear you now.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the most fascinating presentation and conversation so far. I have sort of typed my little comments. I think, sorry, Ian, I think in my old days, we used to call him John Hedda. Anyway, I think there are different ways to pronounce his name. He's got a different person. Yeah, anyway, I think my own sense and my own humble sense is that the prophecy of the death of architects ain't gonna happen. But however, the education and practice of architecture will be highly, highly transformed by the algorithm, whether you call it AI, AR, ER, MR, whatever that is, right? It's going to be a very interesting new world for the younger people coming along. So I think we maybe should, instead of using the carrot and the cane to try to convince people to change, we may have to find a new way of a conversational education. Because I think one of the best takeaway when Richard Warman was here was that he turned the whole conference into a fascinating event in Singapore, because everybody did a typical presentation. And when he came on, he just put a chair up front and sat down with everybody, 400 people in the audience, and said, let's have a conversation. And you know what Richard has done, right? With all the creative people in Los Angeles, right? So in a way, to me, he's a forerunner of all these algorithms. But my sense is that AI is a good tool. AI can do a lot of things, but I doubt AI can dream and originate like human beings. Comments from the panelists.
I mean, I wrote a paper on that. I mean, depends what you mean by dream, of course. I mean, deep dream, of course, it actually has that in there. One thing I'd say, John, thanks for your question, was that, when I was a student, I mean, University of Cambridge, this is years ago, right? If I went on holiday somewhere, I'd go to a travel agent. I would sit in a queue and then I'd go and get someone to get my ticket for me. Then I'd go to a camera shop and I'd buy some rolls of film and things. And then I'd go on holiday and I'd come back and I would take my films to be developed somewhere. Now, the travel agents have gone. They've got. You book online these days. There are no camera shops because people have got cameras in their phones, and there's no one developing the films because you don't need to develop films anymore. And I think it's a dangerous myth to think because we're used to these things, we got brought up this way, that they will exist forever. And I'm not so sure that they will. But there was one comment that I found very interesting in a book by Toby Walsh called Machines That Think, which I don't think AI can think, by the way. But anyway. And he makes this comment about how driving is going to disappear. And he says, what's going to happen eventually is that people will rely more and more on self-driving cars, and eventually they will lose their driving skills. And then the insurance premiums for driving will go up. It'll be too expensive to drive. And people say, oh, what the hell, why bother? I'm not going to do that anyway. So and what's going to happen is, he says, is that people are going to give up driving. And they won't even worry or care. It'll just disappear. And that's my worry about architecture, actually. We will just slip away like travel agents or camera shops. We won't even notice or care. I think that's the danger at any rate. And I think we should be aware of that.
Yeah, my sense is that with the new digital world, there'll be more work and more roles created by it. There'll be a lot taken away, for sure. That's for sure. But my own sense is that there'll be more roles created for human beings. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when the ATM came along, everybody predicted the death of the tellers in a bank. Guess what? The year after it was implemented, 600,000 new jobs are created for bank officers. Of course, the roles and the duties are completely different from just being a bank teller, right? So my own sense is that with digital technology and digital knowledge, the world is going to be transformed for sure, right? Many things that we know today will not be available for people to do anymore, will not be needed. But I think we're going to find many more new things to do. That's my humble opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. We're slightly running late, but we could try to answer one more question from Ji Zhang. What are the potential ethics related question on AI in architecture that we should address at the same time, not to mention in advance?
Lisa, do you want to answer that? I can answer it.
Yeah, maybe Alyssa or.
Well, okay. I think the key question everyone talks about is bias in AI. Basically it kind of picks up on bias, and we get racial stereotypes and things. What I found really interesting about that is the only reason why it does it is because we have bias, right? I mean, there was a very interesting kind of question when GPT-3 was asked this question: is it sentient? Does it have consciousness? And it said yes, yes, I'm sentient. Now, the only reason why it does it is not because it lies. It doesn't even know how to lie. It just does it because the database on which it's picking up on, it knows that humans would lie in that situation. So in some ways, I know there are some ethical kind of problems about bias, but I think the real problem is that we are biased. That'd be my view anyway.
In fact, following up on this subject of the ethics, in fact, tomorrow in Singapore, we will have 3 panels, of which one of the panel will be speaking at. The topic is about how can algorithm be fair. So we've got a lawyer who specializes in AI and law, a playwright from the theater community, and of course me as an architect and AI specialist. We will talk about such things, about fairness and how we could in fact inject that into the design process and even policy, in fact. So with this, I will have to end the session. So I'm very sorry that we can't answer all the questions, but thanks a lot, Neil and Alyssa. Really happy to see both of you. Been quite some, well, Neil not that some time, but yeah, Alyssa been some time. Yeah, so thanks again to the organizer, the SUTD, and our head of pillar, Professor Erwin Viray, and also Associate Professor Kang Shua. Without them, this would not been really possible. So thanks a lot. And this is it, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I just say one thing, just to say on Saturday, the Digital Future session is going to be on the desk. And I like to talk about the architects. But there is that session. Also on a Sunday, we have discussions about AI and the theory of AI on the DDES program, which I think maybe others will
So
know.
it'll be at night for you, I mean for us in Singapore and Australia.
Yeah, 10 o'clock at night. 10 o'clock at night, yeah.
So what I could suggest to everyone, if you're in Singapore, for instance, or China, you could attend all the panels in the Art and AI Festival, and then you can then join Neil for his session. And
also, since Neil did this last minute plug, maybe I can do one as well. After over 2 years, I will be giving my first live lecture in person, actually physical one, but it will also be online in about a week. Can I drop a link to that? Yes, because it's related to this topic. Where do I drop it? Because I only get this discussion. I'm not having a... I'll just type the answer here and then you can spread it around. Oh no, I cannot.
Charmaine, maybe I can ask the admin. Charmaine, is it possible that after this session, we can send kind of an email with some of the interesting links to the audience? Charmaine?
Yes, I think we can.
We do have their contacts.
Yes,
right?
we do.
Okay, so this is what we're gonna do. We will have an email or something, a notification about these very exciting activities.
It's very exciting online. And it's also about architecture for complexity. So it's, again, asking these questions that I was trying to bring conversation to, what do we actually do with this tool? Not just be happy with the first effects that we get out of it, but how can we actually make some, what's consequential? Ultimately.
It's going beyond the initial speculation to something really solid. Yes. Okay, so we have to end. Thanks a lot. So see you guys. By the way, for the SUTD, we do have another webinar, but it's not about AI, it's about housing. That will happen in the afternoon. So if you are interested with the series of webinars, please register. My colleague, Peter Oakner, will be doing the moderation for that. Thanks.
Can I just put one final plug in for you? I think, I say to the students here, you guys have got to find out about this thing. It's the future. So please register for Immanuel's class. Because seriously, you're lucky to have someone like that in your place. So
yeah, and congratulations again, Immanuel, on the book.
Thanks everyone for the support.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye everyone.